The holiday season is in full swing. Many of us are feeling the festive spirit and with it, the urge to splurge. But experts warn that while it's easy to get caught up in the holiday shopping frenzy, overspending now could leave you with a financial hangover come January. Well, let's speak more on this and welcome in studio Annelien van der Poel, the COO of the Debt Rescue, and Owen Khumalo, financial advisor. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Owen, perhaps let's start with you. The economy is not doing well. We are seeing consumers really battling under high prices, whether it be fuel or shopping spending. How can consumers better distinguish between needs and wants, especially when planning for their holiday period? I would imagine the planning for some started some time ago.
You're right, Unati. I think planning is key around this time period. We've just seen people go through spending splurges around Black Friday. So it's going to be critical that they plan well for the coming holiday season so that they don't overspend. You're right that the economy is not doing well. GDP growth has actually come down in the last quarter, though by a smaller margin. But the key is that interest rates are still high. Yes, they're starting to come down. We've seen 2 interest rate cuts by small margins of 25 basis points. So the cost of servicing debt is still very high. Cost of living is still very high. So consumers are advised to exercise discretion and be careful around their spending habits this season.
And I'm going to want us to go into just some of the details in terms of how they can do that, because as we're saying, they're so, some people are desperate. But Annelien, you are the COO of Debt Rescue. A lot of the times when people hear Debt Rescue, they really do panic. Just talk to us about how your service helps people that are already in debt.
Well, I think what's really amazing about this is it forms part of this incredible National Credit Act that we have, and it brought in debt counselling. And debt counselling is a legal method to assist over-indebted consumers who cannot afford to cover their normal monthly living expenses as well as their debt repayments, to restructure their debt legally, repay it at a lower monthly installment over a longer period of time, and eventually become debt-free and gaining that legal protection throughout the process.
So when people hear things like, do you want your debt to be consolidated? A lot of the times you hear people saying, don't do it. Why is that? Is it a risk for somebody who probably when they are debt free, they won't be able to get some of, the luxuries that they need? Well,
obviously when we talk consolidation, we've just got to distinguish between consolidating your debt into a single payment, which is what debt review does ultimately, or a consolidation loan, which is in essence more debt. That's probably one of the biggest misunderstandings about debt counselling, is that you will never get debt again. We can speak for thousands of consumers who've completed this process successfully, have been able to re-enter the credit market, buy homes, buy vehicles, get more credit very, very easily. Because ultimately the whole point is you've proven through this process that you want to honour your debt repayments. You're just unable to at that point in time.
And Owen, perhaps back to you, and before you get yourself into even more debt, how do people better plan their finances? Because a lot of the time, and what we've seen, especially after COVID, is that a lot of people lost their jobs. Some went back into the job market, but are not necessarily earning as much as they would like. So therefore the spending becomes more and people are not living above their means, or they are living above their means and not within. So what should you do to be financially conscious, and spend better?
I think planning ahead of time is essential. So budget for the expenses that you expect to be coming through in future. And you mentioned earlier on that a lot of the planning for the holiday season spending hopefully started a few weeks or a few months ago. So it doesn't come as a surprise, and it helps consumers to avoid the debt trap where they overspend, unplanned expenses. And I think it's also a difficult period where when you spend time with the family, you're bound to spend. So planning there is essential, but also resisting peer pressure, either from your family or from friends. Try to match their spending habits. So stick to your budget. I think sticking to your budget is very, very key. I think also what's important for me around this season is the lag time, the long period between the December salary payments and the January salary payments. Most people will get their December salary payments before the 15th of the month, and it's a long road to get to the next salary payment in January.
And I think therein lies the problem, because then you're tempted to take out maybe a second or even a third, God forbid, credit card. What then should people be mindful of during that time? Because a lot of the times you'll see that the retailers or, your creditors will send you messages saying that on this month we will debit your account, which is much earlier than you would expect. What then should people do to make sure that they don't fall into that trap of taking out a second credit card or even not paying for some of their debt during the 2-month period, essentially, that is the festive season?
Yeah. I think sticking to one's plan is important.
Yeah.
So if you've got a plan and you've budgeted for your expenses during this holiday period, stick to that. And then I think it will avoid the pain of having to take out debt early in January to try and fund expenses that we know will come up for schooling especially. And some missed debit orders in December that we'll need to cover in January. So sticking to one's plan is going to be critical during this time.
And Alina, I want to talk about the legalities around just your debt, and as you try to review it or even consolidate it, what should people be looking out for? Because somebody will say, if you haven't paid your car, rent or whatever, or your bond or whatever, at least there's a 2-month kind of leeway, and some people will say on the 3rd month you're in trouble. What are the warning signs that you are headed that way, and what should you try then to prevent?
I'm so glad you raised that, because there's a lot of these misunderstandings out there of people, saying things like, oh, if you just pay 50 Rand, don't worry, then they'll do nothing, that kind of thing. That's a very, very big risk that you are taking. In terms of the National Credit Act, ultimately, if you're in default of your payment, your credit provider has the right to give you notice and give you the opportunity to take corrective action within a set period of time. And if you don't, then they can proceed with legal action. And that legal action, if it's an asset, they can proceed with obtaining a judgment and ultimately repossessing it. So definitely do not skip payments. Do not think partial payments are going to appease them and keep them away. That's definitely not the answer. Quite the contrary. It's taken in an incredibly serious light, missed payments, especially on assets. Not that unsecured debt isn't the same, but rather be proactive and say, okay, I've done my budget. I am definitely over indebted. I've cut where I could, and I've taken some action. But don't skip payments. Don't think that 2 months or 3 months or whatever is the cutoff. It doesn't work like that.
But on a practical level, the kind of support that you should be receiving in a time when you are in crisis and you really cannot pay the full amount but can pay partial payment, what then happens? Because one would appreciate that crisis does not happen every day and every month, that it's really just something that is business unusual. Surely then some form of communicating with your lender should also take place. I mean, where do you start? Because if I'm sitting at home and hearing you say that you should not make partial payment, and you really can't, you'd rather then not even approach them to begin with.
Not at all. No, that's not. That I think what I meant is, don't think a partial payment is going to prevent legal action. However, it depends on your circumstances. If it's short term, so say for example, you had an emergency expense and that caused you, then obviously it's an exceptional case. Speak to your credit provider. Quite the contrary. Please speak to your credit provider, explain the situation, and see if they will be forthcoming in trying to find some way to deal with this short-term situation. It's when you have a permanent situation, in other words, no matter what you do, your budget doesn't balance. That's when you need to seek permanent solutions as well, proper long-term. But no, please don't put your head in the sand and go, oh, I don't know, I can't speak to them. Speak to them if it's a short-term crisis situation and try and find solutions.
Because I think a lot of the time that does happen, where people think, I'm not going to say anything, I'm not going to answer my phone, I'm not going to respond to my mail. But Owen, on the flip side of that, you probably find that people on this, rare occasion, given the economic climate, do have more money than they need at this point in time, and they can actually look at other options like investment and so on. Where do they begin? Especially where you find that somebody might have received a 13th check, or they really don't want to spend or overspend, but they want to keep some money aside, whether it's for short-term purposes like school fees or books and stuff like that. Where do they begin?
I think most consumers should start with the school expenses.
Yeah.
By now, most parents know what they're in for come next term, beginning in January. So start by paying for the stationery and the textbooks. So put in your orders now. And once you've done that, and if there's a need for new school uniforms, take care of that now in December. This is before you even start spending for the festivities around the Christmas period and the New Year celebrations. And if there's any money left, then please invest it. I cannot emphasize more on the importance of investing. And it depends on the objective for the investment. Is it a long-term objective that you're investing or saving for? Is it short-term? And there are various investment vehicles that can be utilized for the different time periods for each investment.
And how important is it that people consult with a financial advisor like yourself as opposed to going it alone, especially when they haven't done much research?
Very, very important. Yes, we know financial advice doesn't come for free, but it's the fees you pay to a professional financial advisor are worth the advice that you get, because they can look at your holistic financial plan and advise you accordingly. For example, what are your needs? What are your wants? But what are your short-term goals? What are your medium-term goals? What are your long-term goals? So what do you need in terms of insurance cover? Are you adequately covered? And also, what are you saving for, and what kind of investment plan should you have in place? So it's critical that you seek the services of a professional financial advisor when making those critical investment decisions.
And Alina, I want to ask you this question because we've been talking a lot about people that find themselves in trouble. What's that one advice that you give them when they do come to you? Because I would imagine there are a couple of steps you would have said, you want them to do and know for future purposes, because a lot of the time what we find is under devastating circumstances, people really, really cannot meet their obligations.
I think the most important thing here is it's that horrible B word that nobody wants to talk about, but budgeting.
Yeah.
You have to plan. And that, irrespective of where you are in your financial journey, whether it is you are doing planning for investment and saving, etc., or whether you are trying to make ends meet and see if you are able to manage the debt that, for example, you have, is really go look at your expenses, take those couple of months worth of bank statements. It's an honest moment you have to have with yourself where you go, I might be overspending a bit here, or I've already cut back as far as I can. But plan, whether it is for investment purposes, whether it's for getting out of debt. And it's something that needs to be revised as well. This is not one of those things that you do once a year, because living expenses change.
Absolutely.
Fuel goes up, electricity goes up, then it comes down, interest rate goes up, and etc. So it's something that needs to be revised quite often, but plan.
And where do you start? Because a lot of the time you're told that you can get rid of some of your smaller debt first, and then handle and really strategize around the big chunks. But where does then one begin to even start to manage their debt?
Well, look, there's a couple of methods. So if you're not over indebted, in other words, you're not struggling to pay, it's just how do you prioritize your payments? There's a couple of methods to look at. So if, for example, you have a couple of smaller accounts, but they're very high interest bearing, pay them off first, because ultimately interest is the biggest factor here. And once you've done that, start applying the extra money into, for example, your home loan. Your home loan might not be a very high interest account on a number value, but the impact additional payments have by you paying in extra as and when you can in the long term can definitely serve you. So just looking at your type of debt is very important.
Fantastic. Oh, and wrap it up for us. So we've got 30 seconds left. What is the one advice that you can give people, especially during this time? I mean, we've just seen the petrol hike, fuel hike, in fact, in this month, in December. A lot of people saying, where did that come from? So what are the very quick tips that you can give people over this festive period?
I think planning is important. Stick to your plan, have a budget and stick to it. But spend on the essentials. Resist the temptation to splurge on things that you don't necessarily need, and avoid going into unnecessary debt.
And that's the buzzword, isn't it? Avoid debt. All right. Thank you so much to you both. Really do appreciate your time. All right. Well, there you have it, our guest this afternoon, Anneline van der Poel, the COO of Debt Rescue, and Owen Khumalo, financial advisor.